Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. Our program is about to begin. The National Endowment for the Humanities is pleased to welcome you to the 2018 Jefferson Lecture in the Humanities at the Warner Theater. During the program, we ask that you silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. Flash photography is not allowed. We also request that you do not ask the lecturer to sign books or give autographs. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the presentation of the colors by the Joint Armed Forces Color Guard. Please remain standing for our national anthem. Please be seated.
Lights, can we go to blue lecture mode?
Ladies and gentlemen, the Chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, John Parrish Petey.
Good evening. I want to thank the National Council on the Humanities for helping me select Dr. Rita Charon as the Jefferson Lecturer in the Humanities, the highest honor the federal government awards in our field. I also want to thank the National Trust for the Humanities, our longtime partner in the Jefferson Lecture and in other endeavors. And I want to recognize my colleagues at the Humanities Endowment. If you work at the NEH or have before, would you please stand? What an honor. What an honor to serve with you. The work of supporting the humanities throughout the United States is in our hands. is in the hands of our partners, the state humanities councils, is in the hands of our grantees. Grantees, would you please stand? Thank you, each of you, for your passion and dedication to NEH. As we slowly approach the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding, NEH is building on our support for innovative projects that extend and strengthen the infrastructure of humanities study and programming so that we may commemorate in this shining city upon a hill the lasting achievements of our still young republic. Now it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce the 2018 Jefferson Lecturer in the Humanities, Rita Charon. Dr. Charon is the founding chair and professor of medical humanities and ethics and professor of medicine at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. She is also the founder of the field of narrative medicine, which seeks to improve patient care by putting the act of storytelling at the heart of medical practice. Dr. Charon is not only a fine and thoughtful medical doctor, she is a literary scholar as well. And what a scholar. Rather than pontificating about applied humanities, she is busy conducting a distinguished career rooted in the lived humanities. After you hear her speak, it will not surprise you to learn that she was a voracious reader as a child, a passion she never lost. Rita Charon was a Harvard Medical School graduate and a promising young professor at Columbia University when she walked over to the English department and asked to take a literature course, which in turn led to a PhD with a dissertation on Henry James. We could spend the entire evening, of course, quoting James, but one particular statement stands out in my mind. He wrote that, quote, "Deep experience is never peaceful," unquote. I would hazard a guess that Dr. Charon knew this fact as a practitioner of medicine, but clearly she did not find it so well stated in her textbooks. So she and others set about changing that. From Dr. Charon, we can learn a great deal about the connection between reading and empathy. By her personal example, she has illuminated the link between close reading and listening closely. How well we care for each other is a measure of how well we give our attention, our minds, over to each other, especially to each other's words. Dr. Charon reminds us that it is in stories that we find each other's humanity, each other's humanities, I might say. Flannery O'Connor wrote, "It takes considerable courage at any time in any country not to turn away from the storyteller." That is the kind of courage Rita Charon has placed at the center of her message to doctors and to the healthcare community. Listen closely to your patients through their tales of brokenness, through their fragile but steadfast hope. It is a hard work, but essential to the well-being of doctors and patients alike. Indeed, such conversations are essential to our society writ large. To listen is to care. There is no health care without caring. President Lincoln, at the edge of the darkest moment of our nationhood, called for each of us to find the better angels of our nature in each of us. Tonight's speaker is here to illuminate how we might go about that task. Please join me in welcoming the 2018 Jefferson Lecturer in the Humanities, Dr. Rita Charon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chairman Peedy, National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Council for the Humanities, National Trust for the Humanities members, and colleagues, scholars, friends, students, citizens, all of us here in this gorgeous theater. Let us spend an evening thinking exactly about what John Peedy just said. The other thing that Henry James says that I try to live up to is try to be one of those people on whom nothing is lost. Isn't that what you want your doctor to be? And this evening also lets me salute the many clinicians, scholars, teachers, students all over by now the US and the world who are joined with me in developing narrative medicine, medical humanities as the most surprising phenomenon. It is telling you, what I will tell you tonight is that bridging the chasms between the arts and the sciences, between literature and medicine, quite remarkably improves the care of the sick. This is remarkable, and this is what we are developing and now proving. I dedicate this lecture to Stephen Marcus, Delacorte Professor of English at Columbia University and my former supervisor, whose death this year is for all of us a tragic loss. He was the one at Columbia to envision medicine's need for the humanities and to equip me to do the work I've been able to do. It was with his guidance, Stephen's guidance, that we at Columbia developed the branch of medical humanities that we've called narrative medicine. I'm going to tell you stories tonight. I begin with one story. This is a planet. You may or may not recognize it's Uranus, the planet. But I open with a story about it. Astronomer and musician William Herschel and his sister Caroline search the night skies. They invent and construct larger and larger optical instruments so as to scan the skies of the English Lake Countries. Herschel proposes an anti-Newtonian astronomy, not Newton's stable, predictable, symmetrical, knowable universe, but a universe of dark spaces, never ending, always changing, boundless. Who were the Herschel's teachers and colleagues? Wordsworth, Keats, and Shelley. They were together, late 18th century, at the Royal Society of London, these artists and scientists together teaching one another. Wordsworth teaches Herschel the mystery of the stars, do you see? While John Dalton, who invented atomic theory, Humphrey Davy, who discovered potassium and chloride, are writing poetry with Keats. Do you see? So the Herschels discover Uranus in 1781. Wordsworth publishes lyrical ballads in 1798. And Herschel's universe, the universe that Herschel, I'm going to say, imagined, is close to what we today believe about the skies. We call this period the Age of Wonder. It encouraged a fusion of the horizons between the sciences and the arts, leading to the major discoveries of their time. And I propose that we are embarking today on a present age of wonder, perhaps more consequential than the first. Musicians and neuroscientists together now discover how the brain interprets sound. Landscape artists and oceanographers work together to expose the seashore of the Boston cityscape. Novelists teach pediatric oncologists how to accompany their young, dying patients with care and hope. So this is not a dream. This is real. I hope it's dark enough in this room for you to see this charcoal gray sea. It's wrinkled, a gray sky, uniform in matte light. I want you to stare at this sea if you can. I hope perhaps you see it moving. It's swelling gently, this sea. This is Hiroshi Sugimoto's Sea of Marmara, Silivri. You notice, please, the scene is bisected immediately exactly at the center of the frame by an absolutely straight horizontal line, a line which is identical with the horizon. Do you see? I mean, this is funny. This is the wit of Sugimoto to assert that what we call horizon is neither only concrete nor only abstract, but both. That a thing can be concrete and abstract at once. This image is highly denotative. It points to the Sea of Marmara in Silivri, Turkey. Yet what it denotes seems pale compared to what it connotes. And as you look at this, and it will depend on each viewer, some might see an expansive plenitude, an openness to this scene, where others may see an emptiness or an unidentifiable absence. I first saw the photo in Hirshhorn Museum. I hope some of you saw it too. The installation was called What Absence is Made of. Now, with or without that directive from the curator, I do not think it is possible to look at this image and think only of the Sea of Marmara. How can I not show you a Mark Rothko bars of color after that? This is Blue, Green, Brown, 1952. And Rothko accomplishes the same gesture without the sea in the sky, but still sectioning vertical distance with a series of horizontals. And here, if you stare enough at these zones of color, they move. You gaze at them, the blue blurs into the green, the brownish at the bottom. It always looks like earth to me, and maybe there's something rooting around in there. Now, like the Sea of Marmara, there's no character here, there's no plot, but neither is there a here. Huh? Unlike Sugimoto's sea, that points to a specific location, Rothko's bars of color are a fantasy. They sprang from within him. He created them. They visited him. If you will, he made them up. They're not denotative, they're highly connotative. In another way of speaking, they're not real. Rothko writes in his manifesto, The Artist's Reality, that the artist's chief preoccupation is the expression in concrete form of their notions of reality. Do you see? Expanding for us what counts as real. If you sit in the Rothko Chapel in Houston, if you visit the Seagram Room at the Tate Modern in London, you will see that Rothko paid exquisite attention to even how the paintings are installed. He not only governed the height of the paintings on the wall, but the benches, the seating, the lighting. And he says that he wanted the viewer to be able to absorb the paintings. I think he wants us to be absorbed by the paintings, as he was absorbed in creating them. He wanted us to be summoned into these paintings, and in the process, to be transformed. I show you these images in order to invite you to meditate with me on things abstract and concrete, denotative and connotative, what things count as real, what's the status of the things we call imagined. Scientists and artists might think that they each deal with only one or the other of those poles, yet I want to show you, or we'll look together, at how permeable are the membranes that seem to separate them. I spend my working days in a hospital, surrounded by persons seeking help with their health. I can tell by what floor someone gets off the elevator what's wrong with them. 14 is the organ transplantation unit. 12 is the suite for troubled pregnancies. So that persons' intimate facts and secrets of themselves become visible, kind of transparent to those of us who work there. Now we're attuned to, some think we're indifferent to, but we're attuned to the views, the person's bleeding, seizing, breathless. We're always ready to act because we know in particular situations what to do. We've all answered those calls to, is there a doctor on board? We know within limits that we can do something useful, that is the bequest of our training, so we look for things that can be fixed. I'm here to suggest that there's much more beyond the fixable that doctors must learn to see. Beyond the bleeding and the seizing, we need to see the complex lived experience that persons come to us with as they face health problems. If we do not see this complex lived experience, we miss the very reasons they've come to us. It's not just their symptoms or their abnormal lab tests, but rather their fears, their awareness of their own fragility. And I'm convinced, with evidence to support my conviction, that study and practice in the humanities is the most direct way to enable doctors to see this suffering that surrounds them. Now, what does it take to see this complex human suffering or the complex phenomena? I must say, it's not just the suffering we see. There's a great deal of joy as well. But what does it take to see this complex lived experience? I'm proposing that it takes what we just did in looking at these images that I showed you. As we looked closely at them, what did we do? We took in simultaneously the composition, the tableau, the context, the content of what we see. We noticed the sensory details, the color, the contrast, the proportions. We could imagine at least the sounds and the smells of that ocean. We pay attention to our own affective responses, our emotional responses to what we see. We notice what associations we have to what we're looking at. We wonder about the many possible contradictory meanings, again, both denotative and connotative. We surrender ourselves to the experience of beholding what is in front of our eyes. It's as if we asked W.J.T. Mitchell's question that he asks about pictures. He says, what do pictures want? So we're saying, what does this scene want? And in the medical idiom, what does this person want? Now, of course, we do similar things as close readers, where we're paying attention to the formal elements of a text, the temporality, the space, the metaphor, the voice, the narrative situation, the diction. We assess the ideas and the quality of the work, while at the same time experiencing the work as a whole, including these multiple contradictory meanings. We critique and analyze the work at the same time that we're summoned into its world, moved by its meanings. How similar this is to my medical work. I pay attention as an internist to signs and symptoms of disease, ruling in or out their possible causes, deciding what to do. And at the same time, I open myself to behold the patient's singular situation, to hear the story, to imagine the narrative world being described and into which I'm being invited as a guest. I catch the denoted and the connoted. I catch the abstract and the concrete, the real and the imagined. And it's that allows the patient to feel heard, to feel recognized, to enter whole into care. The question I ask is not W.J.T. Mitchell's, it's Simone Weil's question, the philosopher. She writes, "The love of our neighbor in all its fullness means simply being able to say to him, 'What are you going through?'" Training in the humanities equips one to do this and to do it all at once. I'll show you more. This is Whistler. This is Whistler. It's a small painting. It's like 28 by 18. It's a small painting. He calls it Sea and Rain, Variations in Violet and Green. Now, the palette seems at odds with the scale. The palette's very soft, the palette's very subdued, and the scale is enormous. He's got all that sea and all that sky. I want you just to, can you see it? It's a very, very subtle painting. I hope you can see it well enough there. Notice what reaches you, what you find yourself wondering about. You know, here there is a character, right? There's not really a plot, but there's a character. I want you to wonder, what's the mood of this painting? Where does it bring you as you look at it? I imagine some of the words that come to mind are things like vastness or magnitude, maybe solitude, maybe loneliness, I don't know, maybe independence, maybe mastery. I hope you can tell that the human figure, can you tell? The human figure is kind of translucent. Yes, do you see that? You can see through it, especially the legs. Now, we're not sure what that means, you know? Is it not finished, maybe, the painting? So when I look at it, as I stood in front of the painting, I had two conflicting senses. The first one was all this sea and sky and strand for this one guy. It seemed so munificent. But at the very same time, I'm wondering, but wait, is he being erased? Is he an afterthought? Is he expendable? Do you see the tension there? I had to hire a painter through a website in London to copy this painting because I wanted to live with that question. Which is it? All this universe for me, or is the human figure expendable, being erased? This is the question that I felt I needed to live with, and the answer changes for me from day to day. Now, unlike Sugimoto and Rothko, Whistler gives us a body to contemplate. Medicine treats bodies, and bodies are not things. I mean, they are things, but they're also more than things. And in committing a Jefferson lecture to medicine and the humanities, the endowment is making a powerful statement about the centrality to the culture, not just to medicine and science, of the problem and the gift of the body. We in the humanities are, and I think this is subversive, reappropriating the body from the sciences who have kidnapped it. Not only is the human body a piece of biological equipment, fixable sometimes, to be discarded when it reaches the end of its functional lifespan, it is the singular expression of the time-space coordinates of one being, whose very identity is exhaled with each breath. It's another way of saying the body is where we live. So Whistler shows us this very tense relation between the singular body and its inanimate surrounding. The temporality of the body conflicts with the temporality of this sea and sky, which is enveloping it. It's eternal, it's timeless. If I send a vial, listen to this, my biochemistry professor tells me, if you send a vial of seawater to the hospital chemistry lab, it looks identical to human serum. You get it? So seawater runs in our veins. All right? So you know, be that as it may, what this painting shows is that the human scale of physicality, the cosmic scale of the oceans and all of relativity, and the existential dilemma of meaning are together in the universe, and in each individual human body. Now I complicate it. I give you two bodies. So the problems of embodiment now become the problems of intersubjectivity, communication, love, sex, violence, duty, pleasure, protection, difference. This is a pastel by Mary Cassatt, and it came to me, or I found it, as my group and I were describing the three movements of narrative medicine. We tried to conceptualize why it was that reading and writing are good for doctors. And our three movements were attention, representation, and affiliation. This seemed an icon of attention. How can one person absorb what another says and be absorbed into that teller's narrative world? How can the listener achieve the attention required to appreciate what the sufferer undergoes? The listener here is in the shadow, the teller is illuminated. The listener's expression is not pity or sympathy, but rather thoughtfulness, openness, maybe curiosity. As I sit with patients, I do all I can do to donate to them my full attention, putting aside as well as I can distractions, other concerns. I wheel a chair away from the computer. I put my hands in my lap. I don't write. I don't type. I say, sometimes this is the only sentence I need to say. If this is a new patient, I'll say, I will be your doctor. I need to know a lot about your body, your health, and your life. Please tell me what you think I should know about your situation. And then I listen to the plot of the story and the form of the story, the course of events in whatever order the patient tells me. I notice the images, the temporality, the spaces described, the stuttering, the silences, the tears. Now, I'm not identifying with this person. I'm not saying, what would it be like for me to be in this situation? That's self-involved. Instead, the question is, what must it be like to be there? What governs this strange narrative world that I'm hearing about for the first time? What is its climate? What are the habits? What are the rules? How can I take in everything being offered by this person? As literary critics ask of the reader's responsibility to the work, how can I fulfill the duties I incur by virtue of hearing this account? After this intensive listening, we call it radical listening, and after examining the patient, checking the clinical information, making decisions with the patient, I write down what we did, or what I think we did. The second movement is called representation. It's when we represent, when we confer form on what has been perceived, that we can actually perceive it. So we teach our students, we teach our colleagues to not only write perfunctorily in their medical chart, but to write fully what it is that they hear. I write in order to find out what I've perceived. And after after I finish writing for the electronic medical record, I've gotten into the habit of turning the monitor around toward the patient so that she can read what I've written, but I also turn the keyboard around and invite the patient, please add what you think you'd like to add, because this is a story that is about you. And they're very enthusiastic about doing that. So what it means is that we both can share in this experience of writing toward the discovery of what it is that we're telling, letting both of us learn something new by virtue of the representation. And then sometimes I'll write beyond the chart. Simply if I'm still brooding about a patient, I'll write what I think is going on perhaps. These writings don't go into the hospital chart. They're just for me and the patient. but when the patient reads what I've written, they'll say, you know, you got the names wrong or the date was wrong. But then they'll say, we left something out. And that's when I hear about losses, stillborns, childhood trauma, violence, a lot of death, and also hopes and desires and dreams. So that all of this has a way of getting into the medical work that we do. And without my narrative medicine routines, these aspects just would not become part of our care. So I'm coming up to the question of, here we are in my office, there's two bodies. We don't talk just about the bodies, but what are bodies for? Or even what are bodies? When persons get off the elevator toward the organ transplant unit, they're not just passively bringing their bodies in for care, but they're rather becoming with every step. We've learned from the phenomenologists, from Husserl, from Merleau-Ponty, from Paul Ricoeur, who challenged Cartesian dualism. We've learned that it is through the body that we creatures are able to live in the world. We interact with the world only through our bodies, our senses, our perceptions, our physical capacity to move through the world, not only as passive observers, but as dynamic agents who, like Rothko, create our realities by making or interacting with what surrounds us. We create our reality. The reality is not preformed before we get to it. We create the reality. It makes me ask, what is it that gives us the right and the privilege and perhaps the burden of existing in space? Because these are all ways that we have found to be existing in space. We have a location in the world, and it's through the body that we are placed that gives us, if you will, our GPS, right? Like even before GPS, we all had a global position that is second by second integral to our definition of self. So we know that our bodies don't just carry us around, they're not just vehicles, but rather they hold and curate our past toward that dynamic, fleeting, ever-changing in the light thing that is the self, the person, the identity, the me. As the memories and the scars and the pleasures that we have experienced incarnate what we have lived through, so this body, this self, is all we have at Augustine's razor-thin present, trajected toward that blooming, unknown future. So now you see that I've just turned from space to time. This is Hasegawa Tokuhu. It's called Pine Trees. It's from 1595. I showed this to a group of Japanese clinicians in Tokyo. In Japan, the pine tree is a symbol of vitality, virility, strength, masculinity. I look at this and I see some healthy pine trees. Some seem to be falling. Some are enshrouded in mist. Some look like ghosts of pine trees. But one of the Japanese doctors corrects me. He says, no, he says, no, they're all the same tree. Yes? So we're reminded here by both the inevitability of the flower and the decline in a life in time, but also the timelessness, the synchronic, all at oneness, yes, of the living. I still have the heart that I had when I was 3. This impresses me. So the time and the timelessness are together in this image. Now, medicine can sometimes be mistaken for the science that will deliver us from time, right? We expand the lifespan. If you die before there's a cure for your disease, we'll freeze you and we'll thaw you when there's a cure, yeah? But if I may paraphrase what literary scholar George Lukács said about the novel, we might almost say that the entire inner action of medicine is nothing but the struggle against the power of time. So here's a story about time and space. What had the man had to by the loss of it so bleed and yet live? A man stands at the graveside of the woman who loved him. May Bartram has to die her hematological death in order for our man, John Marcher, to recognize her love and his failure to have loved her back. Not until he sees the face ravaged by grief at the neighboring graveside in London does he realize what he has wasted. Henry James's savage short story, The Beast in the Jungle, shocks its reader into attention. The couple looks ordinary to the outside, yet they tiptoe their days around a maniacally held conviction that some absolutely terrible grand thing will befall Marcher, that he has to be saved for something less banal than love and marriage. The reader gradually recognizes Marcher as a weak, deluded man, afraid of true emotion, and May as a woman who, to her tragic misfortune, has, as the narrator puts it, a screw loose for him. Having myself a screw loose for Henry James, I've been hounded by the story while marveling at its perfection. As I read this 1903 tale written by my neighbor of over a century ago in New York's Greenwich Village, I surrender myself to this man and woman, this death, this relation. The story doesn't boil down to some local realization about one's own life and love and losses, but instead enlarges the attentive reader to simply see more, to rail more against stupidness, to accept more of necessary weakness, maybe to feel more for the other, to admit more about the self. Reading this story, or any great text, exposes the possibility of the life of consciousness, the singular consciousness. By virtue of the form as well as the content, the story gives the reader means by which to utter the unutterable, thereby expanding both the inner life and that which can be shared with others. This is what words do. This is what reading does, at least the kind of reading that we in the Humanities tribe call close reading. Every day in our hospitals, people routinely witness the grief of others. Doctors, nurses, therapists, all of us who work around the sick and dying are engulfed by grief. We walk by the waiting rooms of the intensive care unit, of the operating rooms, gazing matter-of-factly at groups huddled together, weeping in the wake of a white-coated stranger who has just delivered horrible news. We're often the ones to have borne it. We take classes in how to break bad news. We don't take classes in how to comprehend the force of that news. A former student of mine, Anna DeForest, an accomplished fiction writer before she came to medical school, describes a scene she witnessed in an intensive care unit somewhere during her training. I'm going to read you what she wrote. This was published in JAMA. I think of a meeting in the intensive care unit. A man in his 30s has crashed his car into a tree and was brain dead. His family was Spanish speaking, and when the attending physician had finished his speech, The man's father asked through an interpreter, "How did it end?" The physician described at length the effects of swelling on the brainstem. The father just asked again, "But how did it end?" "It was painless," I said, before the doctor could recite more physiology. So, what did Dr. DeForest do that the other doctor could not do? Both she and the other doctor had cared for this patient throughout the intensive care unit. They knew how catastrophic the injury had been. They knew the sheer impossibility that he had been conscious through any of it. Yet she knew or could imagine what the father was asking. It was her literary skill, I suggest, that gave her the capacity to read and respond to the father's ravaged face. What had the man had to by the loss of it so bleed and yet live? This story enacts the third movement of narrative medicine. I called it affiliation, which is the goal of care. These narrative skills of attending, of representing, equip us to accompany the patient, to ally with the patient, to be on the patient's side, instead of solving a problem and then moving on. It lets us be invested in the whole of the patient's predicament, even in this case after the death. We refuse to abandon the patient. You remember John Donne's words in Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions. As sickness is the greatest misery, so the greatest misery of sickness is solitude. I bring you back to Mary Cassatt just to remind us now that this situation, one person giving an account to another, is the obligatory site of healthcare. It doesn't matter how many professionals are on the team, how many people in the patient's family, this is where the work, the diagnostic, the therapeutic, the existential, the spiritual work is accomplished. This meeting between self and other is also, in addition to being diagnostic and therapeutic, it is for us all a node in the ethical life. It is not a meeting between objects, but as phenomenologist and Holocaust survivor Emmanuel Levinas writes, the encounter with the other is both the source of the ethical life and the creation of the individual. He says, a calling into question is brought about by the other, the strangeness of the other, his irreducibility to the I, to my thoughts and my possessions, is precisely accomplished as a calling into question of my spontaneity. I want you to understand that he's saying such a radical thing, that it is the other that brings myself into being. And this is true for both the patient and the provider here. We have to make sure, and we bring the I'm going to say weaponry of the humanities in to protect this inviolability, this strangeness of the patient, even in a time of telemedicine and virtual medicine and artificial intelligence and robots, that it's the humanities that will protect that singularity against the facelessness that some of medicine seems heading for. By now, over 80% of the US medical schools do have some form of teaching of the humanities. We actively recruit the writers, the artists, the composers, because we know that they're able to do things like my Anna DeForest that others cannot do. At Columbia and other schools too, narrative medicine is required through all 4 years. The students can take a master's degree. They can continue this kind of training throughout their medical school. We have found in the research that we've been doing all along that this kind of training increases the self-awareness of the students. It increases what they're able to learn and comprehend and value about individual patients that they're seeing. It improves the function of the team, the healthcare team, which is not always able to work well together. It decreases the kind of disillusion, the kind of, we call it burnout, the emotional exhaustion that is driving doctors and nurses away from practice. It also, we ask the students, so what did you get out of this? They tell us it gave us pleasure. It gave us pleasure. We're also working directly with patients, doing artwork, doing music, doing writing, doing reading. And there's lots of outcome studies now looking at that. So what we're asserting is that the humanities training before or during medical school equips our students, equips our clinicians to recognize human suffering. Now, it's not as if the humanities training guarantees attention to others' suffering. I mean, look around your English department or your philosophy department. So, but I'm raising the potential of these disciplines to develop the skills necessary for attention, to awaken an attunement to others' plights, to equip our students to see beyond the body as object, toward the body as incarnation of an individual, at one and only one location in time and space. We hope they come to know to ask the patient not only what is the matter, but what matters to you. Now, before we said that this human body looked translucent, let me re-suggest that the human body might be transparent, letting us see into its workings. And I can't leave this stage without reminding you and celebrating with you the dazzling work going on now in bioscience, in human biology. We know so much more than we did a month ago, a week ago. I mean, please keep track of what it is we're learning. In treating cancer, for example, we're able to identify the very genetic mutation that has caused the tumor to grow uncontrollably. Instead of cutting the tumor out, instead of radiating it, instead of poisoning it with chemotherapy, we're increasingly able to turn on the body's native defenses that have, because of the mutation, been turned off. Do you see that? It's stunning. It's stunning. And we didn't know this a few years ago. Philosopher and pathologist Georges Canguilhem writes somewhere, "Ce n'est pas le médecin qui guérit la malade, c'est la santé." It is not the doctor who heals the sick, it is health. So our sciences are returning health to the sick. And you know other things. Stem cells are able to create needed tissues, maybe pretty soon needed organs. Precision medicine can identify these genetic defects and then really prescribe exactly what each individual person needs for the kidney failure, for the heart failure. Genetic editing of individual mutations may eventually repair disease-causing mutations. But all of this confronts us with profound fundamental choices and challenges. If the body is time, space, location for that singular individual, what happens when you transform it? As we are so fundamentally transforming the human body today. So we face questions that will determine what constitutes a human being. These are the questions that genomic precision medicine forces us to face. What is identity? What is personhood? Who defines personhood? Who defines health? What happens to memory? What is personal freedom? Who will have access to an individual's thoughts, to an individual's cells, to an individual's tissues? I go back to Rothko to remind me to tell you that he was a Jewish Russian emigre to the U.S. He came to the U.S. in the teens. Throughout his life here in the U.S., he battled anti-Semitism. He was treated as an outsider at Yale, where he studied very briefly. He was denied admission to elite institutions in New York. He died a suicide before he knew how grand, how magnificent his work was. The darkness behind his light reminds me to discuss the dark sides of science and medicine. We know that health disparities exist based on race, class, gender, sexual orientation. We know of the financial conflict of interest and greed and how they deform the science. We know that corporate considerations control much of the science and the science agenda. We know the lack of diversity in the leadership still. So all of these considerations, these dark sides of our science about social justice and equity become part of our work together in both the medical humanities and in medicine itself. You can see from my very short description of the dazzling science right now the need for ethical safeguards in aspects of the sciences that raise moral concerns to protect patients' privacy, to assure fair access to new treatments, to align research with actual health needs, to preserve freedom in an era of encroaching surveillance. And so these problems can't be just given to an ethicist at the very end of the study. Rather, ethical attunement of the scientist is needed at every stage. To do the scientists have to grapple with complex and non-calculable problems. And can we foresee a time when skills and perspectives in the ethics of moral choice and the ethics of the moral compass are built into the very training of scientists and engineers and physicians? The National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Academy of Sciences, the Association of American Medical Colleges are all working very hard at that question. And we're finding ways to bring humanities training into the training of the scientists and the engineers. We're finding ways to bring aspects of science and science's ways of thinking and knowing into the training for the humanities. The National Academy of Sciences recently released their first report on this project. They called it Branches from the Same Tree, which is how Einstein described the arts and the sciences. And the report strongly recommends that we continue this work of interweaving, of intersecting the humanities and the sciences, even at the college, undergraduate, and graduate school level. So what we're coming to see is that training in the humanities frees the physician and scientist from the bias of the observer, achieving a position outside of one's own loyalties to adopt the perspective or the subjectivity of another. Again, this is not to say that the humanities are free from bias. They have, or we have, our own dark side. But to move toward freedom from what the novelist Richard Powers calls the straitjacket of the self, and to awaken the capacity to see the other is the hope and the goal of the inclusion of humanities in healthcare and science. To see that suffering at the bedside or the laboratory is to have the chance to be unconditionally committed to relieving it. By coincidence, 2 weeks ago, I was in Istanbul. And I say to my host, "Where's the Sea of Marmara?" I was in Turkey. It's somewhere in Turkey. They said, "You're on it." And I discovered, I didn't know this. Istanbul is bisected by an inlet of the Sea of it's the Sea of Marmara. And there's a bridge, and the trains go over the bridge from one side to the other. One side is Europe, and the other side is Asia. I didn't know that. And so this photograph takes on so much more significance. It now includes the paradox of belonging and not belonging, of leaving and arriving, and being or not being at home. And it raised to me the slender optimism that perhaps there is a way of unifying disparate cultures toward shared goals. Do you see? And it made me think maybe our medicine and science are forms of diplomacy, able to bridge divides, to transcend the interior conflicts among those of us with human bodies. We share the body, don't we? We share the diseases. We're all going to die of the same ones. And so maybe healthcare can become the planet's State Department. I mean, really, by virtue of our commitment to human health, perhaps we can fuse these horizons between continents, between ideologies, between states, and to envision and articulate a universal commitment to safeguard human health and to safeguard our planet. So we're back to Uranus. I want to say, just in closing, please notice what the humanities derive from medicine, that these things that I've been talking about are indeed the urgent agenda of the humanities today: epistemological questions about evidence, questions about narrativity and identity, relationality, intersubjectivity. Embodiment is what we do in women and gender studies, in queer studies, right? In disability studies, intersectionality. It's ultimately social justice. And of course, senescence and mortality is our daily work in medicine and our daily work in the humanities as well. So that for the humanities, medicine becomes kind of a laboratory. And I offer it to you as a laboratory that dramatizes many of the questions we're asking. So I think medical humanities are the best exemplar and promise of the necessity of crossing these chasms, maybe even a model for chasm crossing in non-healthcare fields. From the private conference in an ICU with this grieving family to setting the NIH agenda, the perspectives of the humanities are indispensable for ethical, equitable healthcare. Can it be that learning how to enter the narrative worlds of our literary texts and visual images can deepen our awareness of patients' subjective lives? Can it be that the humanities not only humanize but also make more effective the care we provide to others? It can be. By virtue of the power of our knowledge, the richness of our cultural products, the tenacity of our efforts, and the commitments we share toward freedom. This unity, this precision, this beauty is what can become our present age of wonder. Thank you. Thank you.
Rita. As NEH's founding legislation says, democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens. We are so fortunate to have had Dr. Rita Charon with us tonight. She is indeed a font of wisdom and vision. Rita, thank you. Thank you so much. Everyone is invited to linger in the lobby to have some food and drinks. All 3 levels are open. At the turn of the stairs to the upstairs is a nice backdrop for photographs. And once she has a chance to catch her breath, Dr. Charon will be in the main lobby to say hello and available for photographs. So on behalf of my colleagues, I want to thank you for coming, and I want to thank you for your support. Good night.